Welcome back to Organized, the business law breakdown, where we make corporate governance more interesting than it has any right to be. I'm Professor Seth C. Oranburg, and today we're stepping into the power center of corporate America, the boardroom. You've probably seen it in movies. A long mahogany table, executives in expensive suits, and a chairman glaring over their glasses at some poor soul who just lost the company $10 billion. But in reality, most board meetings aren't particularly dramatic, and sometimes they're barely meetings at all. Legally, the board of directors run the show, but they don't manage the day-to-day. The day-to-day work is the CEO's job. The board sets the strategy, approves major business decisions, and when necessary, fires that CEO. So today we're going to answer three big questions. What does a board actually do? What legal duties do directors owe? And how can they completely screw it up? Because while a great board can steer a company to success, a bad one can let it crash and burn spectacularly, sometimes without even realizing what's happening. So let's start simple. What's the board's job? Legally, a corporate board has three core responsibilities. First is setting corporate strategy. Boards don't micromanage. That's for executives, and perhaps not the best ones. But they approve big moves, mergers, acquisitions, expansions into new product areas, and major investments. The case of Paramount v. Time, 1989 case, is a classic example. Paramount made an unsolicited takeover bid for Time Incorporated, and Time's board rejected it. They preferred to merge with Warner Communications instead, and you may have heard of Time Warner. Why? The board wasn't just looking for the highest price. They had a long-term vision for the company. They believed there was a better cultural fit. The court upheld the decision under the business judgment rule, meaning boards can think long-term, even if shareholders might prefer a quick cash-out. The second thing they do, which is pretty important, is hiring and firing the CEO. Some would even say it's the most important thing a board does. When a CEO is brilliant, the board gets credit. When a CEO fails, the board gets blamed. Take a look at In re Walt Disney litigation from 2006. The board approved CEO Michael Eisner's decision to hire his friend, Michael Ovitz, as president. 14 months later, Ovitz was out, and he took a $140 million severance package with him. Good job for failing the company. Here's $140 million. Not a bad job if you can get it. But the court ruled in favor of Disney's board and said that the case was a wake-up call that terrible hiring decisions is not good governance, but it's not necessarily a violation of the business judgment rule. Boards are supposed to make sure the company isn't committing fraud, breaking laws, or engaging in reckless behavior, but sometimes they just don't. Boeing's board was supposed to have oversight over safety regulations. And as I mentioned in the prior episode, they had a series of 737 MAX disasters, leading to hundreds of deaths. When boards ignore their responsibilities, they don't just fail companies. They can be personally sued. So a really important dimension of corporate governance is understanding fiduciary duties, directors' legal obligations. So let's ask the question. What legal obligation do directors actually have, and to whom? Directors owe fiduciary duties to the company, meaning they're legally required to act in the best interest of the company, and derivatively, the shareholders. But here's where it gets fun. Delaware courts recognize either 2 or 3 fiduciary duties, depending on who you ask. I think there's 2, but other people will talk about a third, so I'll mention them here. I guess we could joke that they owe 2.5 fiduciary duties. But let's break them down. First is the duty of care. Directors must make informed decisions and act with reasonable diligence. They don't have to be right, but they can't be reckless. They have to actually sit down and review stuff. And the case that said this was Smith v. Van Gorkum from 1985. The TransUnion board approved a $700 million merger within 2 hours, and they didn't bother to read the financial reports. They just kind of trusted the CEO. The court said that's not how this works and found the directors personally liable for breaching the duty of care. After that, boards tend to spend more time with what we call paper and process, reviewing the documents. Second is the duty of loyalty, and this one's kind of simple. No stealing, no self-dealing, no conflicts of interest. A classic case is Weinberger versus UOP from 1983. The board lowballed minority shareholders in a buyout, but it didn't tell them their own financial reports valued the company way higher. The court ruled that was a breach of the duty of loyalty because the directors were trying to get more for themselves instead of the shareholders. You can't do that on television. And then there's the half duty, which I don't believe in, the duty of oversight. Some say it's part of the duty of care, and as I mentioned, I'm one of those people. Others say it's part of the duty of loyalty, which I suppose you could argue if you could claim that loyalty means you're not sleeping in and instead paying attention to the company. But either way, boards can't just ignore problems. The case that suggests there is a duty of oversight is Inri Caremark from 1996, where the court made it clear that if a company has systematic legal violations and the board wasn't paying attention, the board can be held legally liable. And in Manchard versus Barnhill, which is 2019, Bluebell's board ignored food safety issues and people died from a deadly listeria outbreak. And they were held liable for this violation of the duty of oversight. The Delaware Supreme Court ruled that directors can't just assume things are fine. They have to actually ask questions. Some will call this the duty of oversight and call it a separate duty. I personally think of it as part of the duty of care, which says they have to apply reasonable diligence when making decisions and when making not decisions. But in any event, directors can't just ignore red flags, and they actually have to set up active dashboards to see if there are problems. While I'm on the topic of fiduciary duties, I'll mention that in addition to these duties for corporations, if you're in a nonprofit context, there's one more, which is the duty of obedience. The directors or trustees of a nonprofit corporation have to be obedient to the mission of the nonprofit. But that doesn't apply to corporate governance because there isn't a mission other than to make money for shareholders, which is covered by the other two. So who sits on the board? We have two kinds of directors. They're not all the same. There are two types, inside directors and outside directors. Inside directors are company executives, like the CEO, who sit on the board. They have direct involvement in operations, which can be useful, but they also might have conflicts of interest. You can imagine that the CEO has a particular opinion on where the headquarters are located, since he has to go to work there every day, and how much he's paid. Outside directors are not employees of the company. They provide independent oversight. The SEC and major stock exchanges require a majority of independent directors from public companies. In theory, outside directors keep management accountable. In reality, they're sometimes just as bad. I'll give you an example. Do you remember WeWork, the shared workspace company? The board let Adam Neumann run wild. He blew through investor cash on private jets and tequila-fueled quote-unquote corporate retreats that were really just raging parties. When they finally fired him, they paid him $1.7 billion to leave. If anyone wants to pay me $1.7 billion to leave, by the way, I'll take that offer. That's not corporate governance. That's a golden parachute made out of platinum. And it was a problem. So here's why the board matters. Boards set corporate strategy. They hire the CEO and they oversee risk. They owe fiduciary duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty, and some would say the duty of oversight. When they fail, companies lose billions, and sometimes directors get sued, which we'll talk about later. In the next episode, we'll dive deeper on what happens when fiduciary duties are breached, and how courts decide who's responsible when things go wrong. But for now, I'm Professor Seth C. Oranburg, and this is Organized, the Business Law Breakdown. I'll see you next time.